Picture a volume of stone so massive that it exceeds the material used to build the Great Wall of China. Imagine a network of structures so vast that if laid end to end, it would wrap around the Earth at the equator not once, but 10 times. Now, realize that this is not a lost wonder of the ancient world buried in the sands of Egypt or the jungles of Mesoamerica. It is sitting quietly in the forests of the American Northeast, covered in moss and forgotten by the very people who walk past it every single day. If you ask any textbook, any state historian, or any local guide who built the estimated 250,000 miles of stone walls scattered across New England and New York, they will give you a very simple, very confident answer. They will tell you that 18th and 19th century European colonists, struggling to clear their fields for planting, dragged these rocks to the edges of their property to pin in their livestock. It is a story of pioneer grit, a story of agricultural expansion. And for over a century, that explanation was considered a closed case. But when you step out of the classroom and actually walk into the woods, the official story begins to fracture. You start finding walls that do not enclose anything at all. You find walls that run straight up mountainsides at 30-degree inclines where no ox or horse could ever pull a sled. You find structures that plunge directly into the deep waters of lakes, or meandering snake-like lines that serve absolutely no agricultural purpose. So you are left with two completely incompatible realities. On one side, the official historical record insists these are nothing more than the trash heaps of colonial farming. On the other side, the physical evidence in the ground, backed by the deep oral traditions of indigenous peoples, points to a vast, sacred geometry that was already ancient by the time the first European ships dropped anchor. Did a scattered population of struggling farmers truly execute the largest earth-moving project in human history in just a few short decades? Or is the history we have been taught hiding something much older? We are going to look at the official agricultural records, at the staggering physics of moving these stones, at the specific anomalies that colonial farming cannot explain, and at the deep memory of the land itself. To understand the scale of what we are looking at, you first have to understand the ground itself. Long before any newspaper, before any colonial official arrived with a pen and a ledger, the geology of this region was shaped by the Laurentide ice sheet. Around 15,000 years ago, a massive glacier retreated across the northern part of the continent. As it ground its way north, it acted like a colossal piece of sandpaper, crushing mountains and leaving behind billions of tons of loose rock, gravel, and boulders trapped in the soil. Geologists call this glacial till. It is the reason the soil of New England is famously difficult to work. When European settlers began arriving in the 17th century, they encountered this rocky earth. The official historical narrative tells us that as these early farmers cleared the land, they realized that the freezing and thawing of the New England winters created a phenomenon called frost heave. Every spring, the earth would push a new crop of stones to the surface. According to the standard timeline, the farmers spent their winters prying these stones from the freezing mud, loading them onto wooden sleds called stone boats, and using teams of oxen to drag them to the edges of their fields. By stacking them, they achieved two goals at once. They cleared the soil for the plow, and they created fences to keep their sheep and cattle from wandering into the crops. To us, sitting in the modern world, this sounds entirely logical. It is a practical, hard-working explanation for a very physical problem. And the records seem to back it up. In 1871, the United States Department of Agriculture published an official report. They surveyed the fences across the country and concluded that in the New England states and New York alone, there were roughly 250,000 miles of stone walls. Let that number sink in. 250,000 miles. The total volume of stone moved was estimated to be greater than the mass of all the pyramids of Egypt, all the ruined temples of Greece, and all the castles of medieval Europe combined. This is where the story usually stops. The history books present this staggering statistic as a testament to the incredible work ethic of the American pioneer. We are told to marvel at the endurance of these farmers, and then we are told to close the book. If you enjoy stories the history books quietly skipped, consider subscribing, because this channel lives on looking at the pages that were torn out. Because when you stop taking that 1871 report at face value and start doing the actual math, a very deep, very uncomfortable problem emerges. We are going to look at the timeline of when these walls were supposedly built, at the biological reality of the animals they were meant to contain, at the specific architecture of the stones, and at the written accounts of the very first explorers who saw this landscape before it was ever touched by a steel plow. And this is where the story stops being a closed chapter of agricultural history, because the physical evidence simply refuses to cooperate with the official timeline. Let us look at the numbers. According to the mainstream historical consensus, the vast majority of these stone walls were built during a very specific window of time, primarily between 1775 and 1825, with a massive spike driven by a sudden demand for wool. Historians call this period the Merino sheep craze. The official narrative relies heavily on this era. We are told that early colonists built mostly wooden fences because wood was plentiful and fast. But as the forests were cleared for agriculture, wood became scarce. Then, around 1810, high-quality merino sheep were imported to the region. Suddenly, raising sheep was incredibly profitable. The narrative states that a fencing frenzy swept the region, and farmers turned to the endless supply of fieldstone to build their enclosures. But here is the part that should not be possible. If we accept the official timeline, we are forced to believe that a relatively small, widely dispersed population of rural farmers built nearly 250,000 miles of stone walls in a window of roughly 50 to 75 years. Calculate the man-hours required. Moving fieldstone is not like laying bricks. These stones weigh anywhere from 50 to 500 pounds each. Some of the foundation boulders weigh over a ton. A skilled team of 2 men and a yoke of oxen, working from dawn until dusk in freezing weather, might, on a very good day, clear and stack 10 to 15 feet of wall. To build 250,000 miles in such a short era, every single able-bodied man in New England would have had to spend almost every waking hour of his life doing nothing but dragging and stacking rock, neglecting the very crops and livestock the walls were supposedly meant to protect. And then you look at the walls themselves. If you walk into the deep woods of Connecticut, Massachusetts, or Rhode Island today, you will find miles of these structures in places that were never suitable for farming. You will find them running across exposed bedrock where no plow could ever bite into the earth. If these were agricultural clearing piles, why were farmers clearing stone from solid rock? You will find walls that head directly up the sides of steep ravines, maintaining a perfect line over terrain so treacherous that an ox pulling a heavy stone boat would have broken its legs trying to navigate it. Even more troubling for the official narrative is the height of the walls. Most of the stone walls deep in the woods are remarkably low. The vast majority stand between 2 and 3 feet tall. Recall the official explanation. These were supposedly built to keep sheep in and predators out. Now look at the biological reality of a sheep. A healthy merino sheep can easily clear a 3-foot hurdle from a standing jump. A low, dry-laid stone wall is practically a staircase for a grazing animal. Building a knee-high wall to contain a flock of sheep is an exercise in utter futility, and a 19th century farmer whose entire livelihood depended on that flock would have known this better than anyone. So the official explanation asks us to believe that hundreds of thousands of men engaged in the most back-breaking labor imaginable for decades to build fences that could not actually function as fences. Every time investigators try to reconcile the physical reality of the walls with the agricultural theory, another piece of evidence pulls the case back open. Take the layout of the stones. According to the agricultural clearing theory, farmers were just trying to get the rocks out of the way. If you are just dumping trash rock, you toss it into a messy, linear heap. And indeed, some walls look exactly like this. But thousands of miles of these structures do not. They are meticulously laid with carefully chosen interlocking stones. They feature massive foundation boulders that were set with absolute precision. They incorporate niches, standing stones, and massive quartz boulders placed at specific intervals. And here we reach the turning point. The official explanation was simple, and for a long time, everyone accepted it because it fit a comfortable, Eurocentric view of history. It assumed that the landscape was a blank slate, an untouched wilderness waiting to be organized by colonists. But it left the sheer volume, the illogical locations, and the unworkable heights completely unexplained. So we are left with a landscape that holds more stone than the pyramids, built in a time frame that defies human logistics, designed in a way that fails its supposed purpose. One of these accepted facts has to be wrong, unless the whole premise is wrong. And just when researchers thought they were merely looking at anomalous farming practices, a completely different layer of evidence demanded to be heard. Because there was something the official historical record had deliberately ignored for centuries. And when we finally look at it, the whole case changes shape. For years, the oral traditions of the Algonquian-speaking peoples of the Northeast were dismissed by academics as mere myth. The traditional archaeological stance was rigid. They stated that the indigenous peoples of this region were semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers who built strictly with wood, bark, and earth. The textbooks declared that Native Americans in New England did not build in stone, period. Therefore, by default, any stone structure found in the woods had to be colonial. But the indigenous people themselves have always said otherwise. To them, this was not a legend, and it was certainly not a debate. It was history, kept alive by voice for generations. The Narragansett, the Wampanoag, the Mohegan, and the Pequot have consistently maintained that their ancestors built extensively with stone. They built structures known as Manitou Hasanash, which translates roughly to spirit stones. In their worldview, stones were not dead material to be cleared out of the way. Stones held life, memory, and power. When you stop looking at these walls through the lens of a 19th century European farmer and start looking at them through the lens of indigenous cosmology, the anomalies suddenly begin to make perfect sense. Remember the walls that do not enclose anything? In Algonquian tradition, linear stone arrangements were often built to connect places of spiritual power or to guide ceremonial processions. They were not meant to keep animals in. They were meant to direct energy, to honor the ancestors, or to mark the boundaries between the world of the living and the world of the spirits. Remember the meandering walls that snake through the woods in strange curves? In indigenous traditions across North America, the serpent is a powerful spiritual entity associated with water and the underworld. When you view some of these undulating stone lines from above, complete with a larger boulder at one end representing a head, they are clearly effigies. They are stone serpents moving across the landscape, practically identical to the famous Great Serpent Mound in Ohio, only rendered in glacial till rather than earth. A farmer rushing to clear a field plots the shortest, straightest line between 2 points. A farmer does not waste precious days arranging fieldstone into the shape of a perfectly curving snake. Now put this together with the written documents from the era of first contact. The official narrative relies heavily on 19th century agricultural census data. But if we go back further, to the earliest European explorers, a very different picture emerges. In 1524, the Italian explorer Giovanni da Verrazzano sailed along the coast of what is now Rhode Island. In his records, he described the land as being cleared of trees and mentioned seeing indigenous people living in areas defined by ancient boundaries. When the first English settlers arrived in the 1620s and 30s, their own deeds and land grants frequently mentioned existing stone structures. Surveyors writing in the 17th century used phrases like Indian stone fence or ancient wall as boundary markers. Look at what this means. These documents were written decades before the merino sheep craze, decades before the massive agricultural clearings supposedly began. The early colonists were literally using existing stone structures to map out their new properties. How could European farmers have built these walls to contain their livestock in the 1800s if their own grandfathers were using them as reference points in the 1600s? And the evidence goes deeper than property lines. Over the past few decades, independent researchers and sympathetic archaeologists began bringing compasses and surveying equipment into the deep woods. They started measuring the alignments of the standing stones, the niches built into the walls, and the V-shaped gaps in the linear structures. Time and time again, they found that these structures aligned with astonishing precision to celestial events. They point to the winter solstice sunset, the summer solstice sunrise, the equinoxes, and the major standstills of the moon. One of the most famous examples is the Gunjiwamp site in Groton, Connecticut. It features stone chambers, standing stones, and low walls. On the day of the equinox, the setting sun shines directly through a precisely cut vent in a stone chamber, casting a beam of light that perfectly illuminates a small alcove inside. Traditional historians have tied themselves in knots trying to explain this away, suggesting that colonial root cellars just happened to accidentally align perfectly with the cosmos. But the mathematical probability of a farmer randomly dumping fieldstone into a perfect solar alignment, not just once, but at dozens of sites across New England, is statistically impossible. This is the moment the whole case turns. Because if that astronomical detail is true, and if the early colonial deeds are accurate, then the official explanation is not just incomplete, it is fundamentally backwards. The agricultural theory insists on a blank slate. It requires us to believe that colonists arrived in an empty, untamed wilderness and imposed European order upon it. But the physical alignments, the early deeds, and the unbroken memory of the indigenous peoples all agree on one thing. The landscape was not empty. It was already built. Which leaves only two explanations. Either an extraordinary series of coincidences spanning centuries somehow resulted in farmers accidentally building sacred geometry and solar observatories while trying to corral sheep, or the story we have been telling ourselves for 150 years was never the whole truth. Everything now points in one direction. The sheer tonnage of the stone, the illogical pathways, the celestial math, and the oral traditions all align. And the thing they agree on is the one thing the traditional historical establishment has fought against for decades. So what actually happened out there in the forests of New England? After everything we have seen, it is finally possible to see the shape of the truth, and it is far more complex than a simple choice between two extremes. So here is what actually happened. Not the myth of the empty wilderness, not the total dismissal of colonial hard work, but the reality that the physical evidence and the historical timeline finally demand. The mystery of the New England stone walls is not the result of a single group of people working in a single era. It is the result of a massive, multi-generational layering of history, where one civilization literally built upon the ruins of another without fully understanding what they were touching. The timeline starts thousands of years before the first European ship was even a blueprint. The indigenous peoples of the Northeast, intimately connected to the geology of their homeland, began moving stone. They built the foundation lines, the serpent effigies, the celestial observatories, and the ceremonial landscapes. Because their population existed over millennia, they had the most valuable resource necessary for a project of this scale. They had deep time. They were not rushing to clear a field before the frost. They were building structures meant to speak to the earth and the sky over generations. This is how the impossible volume of stone was initiated. It was a slow, deliberate, sacred process that shaped the entire region. Then, the European colonists arrived. When they pushed inland, they did not find a virgin forest. They found a managed landscape heavily depopulated by the tragic spread of European diseases, but still marked by these ancient stone lines. The colonists, carrying a worldview that saw land strictly in terms of property and agriculture, looked at the sacred stone boundaries and simply saw raw materials. They saw lines that were already drawn. And this is where the two stories finally meet. The colonial farmers absolutely did build stone walls. During the agricultural boom and the sheep craze of the 19th century, they desperately needed to clear their fields and establish borders. But they did not start from scratch. They used the ancient indigenous stone lines as templates. They built their new walls right on top of the old ones. They took the sacred stones and threw their own field trash on top of them, turning ceremonial pathways into property lines. They extended the lines to enclose pastures. In many places, they simply adopted what was already there, occasionally piling it higher to try and stop a wandering sheep. This synthesis explains every single anomaly we have examined. It explains why some walls are meticulously laid with massive foundation stones, while the upper layers look like hastily tossed fieldstone. It explains why early deeds mention existing stone walls long before the farming boom. It explains the celestial alignments that no farmer would ever take the time to calculate. And most importantly, it solves the impossible mathematics of the volume. The reason the colonial farmers could supposedly move more stone than the builders of the pyramids in just 50 years is because they didn't. They were simply the last people to add to a project that had been underway for thousands of years. We cannot prove the exact origin of every single wall in the woods. No one can, at this distance in time, separate every indigenous foundation stone from every colonial field stone. But of every explanation ever offered, this is the only one that leaves nothing unaccounted for. It honors the absolute back-breaking labor of the European settlers who wrestled with the rocky soil to feed their families, without erasing the profound, ancient engineering of the Native Americans who shaped the land first. And that means the indigenous elders who patiently repeated their histories while the academic world ignored them were right all along. They were not speaking in metaphors, they were remembering. The landscape was alive with their work, and the colonial era simply threw a blanket of agriculture over it, hiding the sacred under the mundane. But the answer to who built the walls is not really where this story ends, because what this historical blind spot tells us about ourselves is the part that lingers long after the facts have been settled. We like to think that history is an objective science, built on hard evidence and solid facts. But this vast network of stone proves how easily physical reality can be rewritten if the people writing the textbooks refuse to see what is right in front of them. For over a century, brilliant scholars walked past thousands of miles of complex stone architecture, walked past perfectly aligned solar observatories, walked past walls running straight into the ocean, and decided it was all just the accidental rubbish of men trying to farm. They saw exactly what they expected to see, and nothing more. They assumed that the native peoples were too primitive to build in stone, and that the European settlers were entirely responsible for civilizing the land. That arrogance did not just distort the truth, it effectively erased the largest cultural monument in North America. Everything you know about the past exists only because someone chose to record it, and someone else chose to believe it. The moment we stop questioning the comfortable narrative, we lose the truth. These stones are a monument to exactly that fragility. They sat silently in the woods, enduring the harsh winters and the changing centuries, waiting for anyone willing to look at them without prejudice. Think back to that staggering measurement from the start. A volume of stone greater than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was never a testament to a few decades of colonial sheep farming. It was a measure of deep human time, a physical record of two entirely different civilizations colliding, overlapping, and blending into the very earth. Some doors to the past, once someone finally points them out to you, make it impossible to ever look at the landscape the same way again. The next time you see a low, moss-covered line of stones vanishing into the dark trees, you will know you are not just looking at a forgotten farm. You are looking at the deep memory of the continent. So I want to ask you this. Is there a place where you live, a local ruin, an old boundary, or a familiar landmark that carries a history everyone accepts but that just does not seem to physically add up? What is the official story, and what do you think is really hiding there? Drop your answer in the comments. I read them, and the stories you share there are half the reason I keep digging into these forgotten places. And if this is the kind of history you want more of, the kind that respects the intelligence of the past and the patience of the evidence, then subscribe. That is the only way you will catch the next investigation, and there are far stranger records waiting in the archives. If the journey through these woods kept you here to the end, leaving a like genuinely helps more people find this channel. That is not a small thing. It is the exact engine that allows deep, quiet investigations like this one to survive in a very loud world. Thank you for staying with me all the way through the evidence. Keep asking why the quiet places are quiet, and I will see you in the next one.